welcome to the spookiest episode of all time. Today we're talking about the fantastic new survival games hitting the market, like Dead Space 4, Silent Hills, or Resident Evil 2, maybe? Okay, maybe there isn't a whole lot to pick from in the survival horror market anymore, but why is that? What happened to the survival horror genre? Let's go ahead and rewind all the way back and check out the beginning of survival horror games. People love being scared. The entire idea of scary movies, Halloween, and haunted houses rely on that love. And speaking of haunted houses, let's get into our first title.
Atari Anonymous. My son Boris has a missile command problem.
My mission in life is to save all of mankind.
The Atari 2600 is often considered the grandfather of all home consoles, where the arcade met the living room and also saw the birth of many new types of game genres as well. So it'd only be fitting that the grandfather of survival horror would also be born on this system. Let's jump straight to Haunted House for the Atari 2600.
Just a moment. Right, anyone for Haunted House?
You have to be fast on your feet for this,
Oh, don't say that. I want to show you tap dancing next.
So video games up until this point placed the player in the shoes of a fighter, adventurer, alien slaughterer, space pilot, the usual stuff. But Haunted House was really the first game that sought to put the player in a vulnerable position. You weren't some tough hero saving the universe, you were just yourself, a scared player lost in a haunted house. Hitting store shelves in February of 1982, Haunted House is considered by many to be the very first survival horror title. The gameplay was pretty similar to that of Adventure, which had come out just a few years earlier, but with a little boost in graphical power, Haunted House was able to tell a completely different story. The player must navigate through 4 different floors of a haunted house, warding off spooky bats and spiders and ghosts, the usual horror business. Utilizing a simple lighting mechanic, the player could use matches to light up a small area around them to look for items. When a monster approaches, the match instantly is blown out, and you are lost in the dark with the monster creeping around. The excitement from Haunted House came from keeping the player in the dark, pun intended. The technology limitations forced developers to make players fear what they couldn't see rather than what they could. This also started a trend for the genre as a whole, making the player completely or almost completely defenseless to the monsters. Rather than putting an emphasis on combat, this sort of style was almost completely unheard of for the time. Instead, the player is forced to just avoid the monsters rather than facing them head on. And what was originally a technological limitation would soon become the founding philosophy for the survival horror genre as a whole. And while that's pretty much it for Haunted House, and it may seem simple now, it was an interesting step forward in the industry, opening the door beyond the regular style of games into something slower paced and survival horror based. Now here's one you've probably never heard of, but has a huge credit in crafting the horror games to come.
日本映画の面白男伊丹十三があのスイートホームのファミコン化に成功したぞ。呪われた屋敷に閉じ込め
Sweet Home was released by Capcom for the Nintendo Entertainment System and is what I would declare as the first true horror experience. Not a game that uses horror characters or franchises, we'd seen that plenty before, but a genuinely chilling horror game, and it was on the NES. So why haven't you heard of it? Well, it turns out it's a little landlocked in Japan. So here's the real history lesson. During the early days of gaming, there was no standardization on the rating of video games, so any player of any age could scoop up a game, no matter what the content, and get to playing. Obviously, this didn't sit well with the great majority of angry parents at PTO meetings, so Nintendo of America took it upon themselves to handle the situation. They solved the issue with as much tact as a blindfolded bear, and ended up heavily censoring any religious, violent, or sexual content, or even outright banning it in some cases. Basically, if a child couldn't play it, then nobody could. Unfortunately for Sweet Home, censorship would pretty much cover up the entire game, so a formal translation was never made for the West. Luckily, some darling fans have taken it upon themselves to do the translation on their own, which is why the gameplay you're seeing is in English. With all that in mind, what exactly is Sweet Home? Well, it's a sort of survival horror version of an early Final Fantasy game. You take control of 5 characters inside of a haunted mansion and have to survive monster attacks and solve puzzles in order to escape. What really struck players is the fact that any of your characters can die, and if they die, they will not come back, forcing you to continue the game at a disadvantage. And for the time, the graphics are surprisingly grotesque and brutal. Sequences of your characters being sliced in half and skin falling from their bones can be seen if you fail. Sweet Home was so widely respected by fellow game developers, it sculpted how they would handle their future titles. Mechanics that started in Sweet Home would become mainstays in the future of the entire survival horror genre. Mechanics like inventory management and limited inventories, frequent backtracking, quick-time events, and item-based puzzles. And truthfully, that was the last advancement we saw in terms of survival horror games during the 80s. Haunted House opened the door to horror-esque environments, something that we would see in Castlevania or in Friday the 13th for the NES, but it wouldn't be until 10 years after Haunted House and 3 years after Sweet Home that we'd find the next big stride in survival horror. But a big, big stride it was. Alone in the Dark was released in 1992 for the MS-DOS and was an interesting leap forward for gaming as a whole. Developed and published by Infogrames and Atari, Alone in the Dark was one of the first games to use polygonal character models atop pre-rendered backgrounds, meaning the characters themselves were fully 3D, while the backgrounds were often modeled and screenshotted or drawn as static backdrops. Not only was Alone in the Dark a huge leap for games technically, but revitalized the horror genre as well. Taking the role of Edward Carnaby or Emily Hartwood, the player must explore this old and spooky mansion filled with weird, gross rat things and zombies and whatever that thing is. Alone in the Dark started some interesting horror game trends, like introducing some very simple combat mechanics, but also placed a much bigger emphasis on puzzle solving. Much of the previously mentioned Sweet Home was spent fighting off monsters in a turn-based style, but Alone in the Dark actually had players running away from monsters in real time, similar to Haunted House. Just like Haunted House, the majority of monsters actually can't be killed, so Alone in the Dark gives you the option of slamming doors right in their weird chicken faces or throwing whatever you've got in your inventory at them to slow them down, but that was it. Alone in the Dark was also fairly non-linear, allowing the player to explore and complete puzzles in a somewhat open order as they navigated the haunted mansion. If these mechanics are starting to sound familiar, that's for a good reason. Alone in the Dark somewhat set the groundwork for a pretty big name in the survival horror genre.
Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
The next big stride would be Resident Evil that landed in America on March 22nd of 1996, coming straight from the minds of Capcom and a soon-to-be big name in the industry, Shinji Mikami. While this obviously wasn't the first horror game by any means, this was and still is considered to be the first huge hit horror game, a must-play for basically anyone who loved games. This title took what Alone in the Dark and Sweet Home started and founded the survival horror genre from that foundation. It was a must-have for PlayStation owners, and it was causing consoles to fly off the shelves. However, there's a bit of an interesting history tying Resident Evil to an aforementioned title, Japan's cult classic Sweet Home. Resident Evil was originally pitched as a 3D remake of Sweet Home, hence the heavy similarities in both gameplay style and tone. However, during development, the team found that Resident Evil was growing into something of its own, eventually creating its own unique storyline and image. Despite that, the influence from Sweet Home is unmistakable. Resident Evil ended up matching the tone and feel of a George Romero movie, but in the form of a video game, and that was insane. Horror had left the realm of 2D and became realistic. Or, realistic for the time. RE relied much harder on the combat and difficulty aspects than Alone in the Dark had. Their idea was to balance the puzzle mechanics and zombie fighting as two equal pillars in the game's philosophy. And technology limitations made for some interesting design choices that helped impact this as well. The usage of tank controls and odd camera angles made it even harder to try and fight off the infected. Instead of the camera hovering directly over your shoulder like we might be used to today, the camera was in a fixed location that varied from every single room. Landing a shot in this game was the work of an absolute marksman. While these mechanics make it hard for the game to hold up today, that level of tension has hardly been recreated ever since. If you're looking to go back and enjoy this classic, try the 2015 Resident Evil HD remaster. You can honestly play it on anything with a pulse, and it's definitely worth going back to see what made this game so special. Resident Evil is the whole reason the name survival horror was even born, and was a major contributing factor to the PlayStation's success, even later going on to create a major franchise. And from Resident Evil, things were only going to get spookier. If Resident Evil struck a chord and uneased the weak of heart, Silent Hill chilled even the boldest players to the bone. Konami released Silent Hill at the start of 1999, and what a lovely way it was to kickstart the last year of the decade. If Resident Evil was about fighting terrifying monsters, Silent Hill channeled Alone in the Dark once more and offered players extremely limited ways to challenge the terrifying creatures haunting Silent Hill. Team Silent focused on creating terrifying psychological horror through the scenes that still keep me up at night. Masahiro Ito made his major breakthrough here while working under Konami by designing Silent Hill's creatures. If there's something that Silent Hill is really remembered for, it's the distinct art direction and how much it adds to the scares. While the previous titles would have you fighting against stereotypical enemies like skeletons or zombies or vampires, Silent Hill pitted the player against humanoid creatures unlike anything we'd ever seen, or anything we may ever will see for that matter. Silent Hill has such a powerful, defined aesthetic that it really sticks in the back of your mind after playing it. Without relying on usual jump scares, Silent Hill's Team Silent managed to create a title that was true psychological horror. Unlike Resident Evil, the protagonist has no prior combat training and is entirely, truly alone. Similar to the older Alone in the Dark, you could fight the enemies, but restrictive controls and troublesome aiming made the player feel helpless and only fighting back as a final response. Like Resident Evil before it, Silent Hill would ultimately spawn a massive franchise encompassing many sequels, multiple movies, and even visual novels, and is still successful even to this day. Okay, maybe they don't really do anything with it anymore, but Resident Evil's still doing pretty good. We're almost at the 2000s, which means we have time to talk about one last game. While most other titles put the player in a somewhat powerless or disadvantaged position against the horrors of the night, System Shock would place the player in the role of a soldier.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
While the first game set some groundwork, we're going to be focusing on System Shock 2 for its influence on the future of the industry. System Shock 2 mixed the first-person shooter genre into the familiar survival horror genre to create an experience rather unique. Taking place in a cyberpunk future, the player wakes up on a starship and is tasked with controlling an infection that has broken out among the crew members on board. Unfortunately, the fine folk of the spaceship have gotten particularly infected, and the only cure is a fresh bullet. Similar to previous titles, the enemies are notably grotesque and places the player majorly outnumbered against their sheer strength. However, the combat was tight, the weapon variety was large, and as such, the game placed a huge focus on shooting your way through the horrors rather than hiding from them. Lastly, one can't talk about System Shock 2 without mentioning Shodan. Shodan is the primary antagonist of the game and is very clearly inspired by Am from Harlan Ellison's classic I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Shodan is the AI controlling the ship and the reason for the creation of the infection. The feeling of being inside a ship fully controlled by Shodan makes for a special brand of absolutely terrifying that only System Shock 2 had created. The image of her metallic face, the pulsing wires, and her distorted voice has sat in the back of my mind ever since I was a wee lad.
To gain access to the ship's computer.
You will help me weaken Xerxes. I used Polito's image to communicate.
Irrational Games would later be the same team responsible for the BioShock franchise, a series incredibly reminiscent of this earlier title. The influence can even be seen in other later horror franchises like Fear or Condemned. Obviously, there's plenty more that sprinkled through these early years. Games like Clock Tower, D2, and Parasite Eve come to mind. But we called this a brief history, so we gotta keep it brief. And if you're hearing this, thanks for making it to the end. Hope you enjoyed this brief history on survival horror games, and next time we'll check out what came next. Have a nice day.